There is a specific kind of terror that comes from living far away from the rest of the world. When your nearest neighbor is miles away, the silence can be comforting. But when you realize you aren't actually alone in that silence, the isolation becomes a trap. Welcome to the Cold Case Frequency. It is late March, 1922. Deep in the freezing, snow-covered woods of Bavaria, Germany, sits a secluded farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck. It is home to the Gruber family, Andreas, his wife Ilya, their widowed daughter Victoria, and her two young children. Andreas Gruber was not a well-liked man. He was known in the local village as a tyrant, a cruel, isolated man who kept his family entirely cut off from the outside world. But in the weeks leading up to April, even the hardened Andreas began to look terrified. It started with the snow. One cold morning, Andreas walked out his front door and stopped dead in his tracks. There, pressed deep into the fresh white snow, was a single set of heavy footprints. They emerged from the dark tree line of the surrounding forest, marched directly across the frozen field, and stopped right at the edge of the family's farm. Andreas followed the tracks, looking for the trespasser. But as he traced them, a cold dread washed over him. The footprints led out of the woods and to his home. But there were absolutely no footprints leading back. Whoever had walked out of the forest was still on the farm. The footprints were only the beginning. Over the next few days, the farm was plagued by a quiet, unseen presence. Andreas found a strange newspaper from Munich sitting on his kitchen table, a paper that no one in the family subscribed to or brought into the house. A few days later, a set of house keys vanished completely from his desk. Someone had unpicked the lock on the farm's tool shed, but nothing was stolen. Then, the family began to hear the noises. At night, when the farmhouse was pitch black, they heard the distinct sound of footsteps pacing in the attic above their heads. They heard muffled, whispered voices coming from the ceiling. Andreas grabbed his rifle and searched the entire property, tearing through the barn and the attic. He found nothing. No one was there. 6 months prior, the family's previous maid had abruptly quit and fled the farm, swearing to the villagers that Hinterkaifeck was haunted by malevolent spirits. The Grubers didn't believe in ghosts, but as the footsteps continued in the dark, they realized a living phantom had taken residence in the rafters. On March 31st, a new maid named Maria arrived at the farm to begin her employment. It would be her very first day on the job. It would also be her last. Later that evening, a dark, heavy fog rolled over the Bavarian woods. What exactly happened that night is still debated by investigators, but forensic evidence paints a horrifying picture of how the phantom finally struck. The killer did not break into the house. Instead, he went into the barn and waited in the pitch black. For some unknown reason, the family members were lured out into the freezing barn, one by one. First came Andreas, then his wife, then their daughter, Victoria, and finally, her 7-year-old daughter. As each person stepped into the dark barn, the killer stepped out from the shadows. He was wielding a heavy mattock, a farming tool similar to a pickaxe. With brutal, calculated efficiency, he struck them down, dragging their bodies into a corner and stacking them on top of each other, covering the gruesome pile with hay. The killer then walked calmly into the farmhouse. He made his way to the maid's bedchamber, where he killed the newly arrived Maria. Finally, he stepped into the nursery and silenced the youngest child in his crib. The entire Gruber family had been erased. The brutality of the Hinterkaifeck murders is legendary. But it is what the killer did after the massacre that makes this case the most deeply unsettling mystery in German history. The killer did not flee into the night. He stayed. For the next 4 days, the murderer lived inside the farmhouse with the 6 bodies. Neighbors passing by the property reported seeing smoke rising casually from the chimney. The cattle and the farm animals were carefully fed and tended to. The killer cooked meals in the kitchen, ate the family's bread, and slept in their beds. By the time the village authorities finally realized the family was missing and breached the farmstead on April 4th, the killer was gone. He had vanished back into the freezing woods, leaving behind a cold fireplace, half-eaten food, and a mystery that would never be solved. To this day, over a century later, the Munich police files on Hinterkaifeck remain open. Over 100 suspects have been interviewed. None have ever been charged. Who was the phantom in the attic? How long was he watching the family through the floorboards before he finally came down? And how could a man butcher an entire family only to calmly feed their livestock the very next morning? Let me know your theories in the comments. If you dare to hear more of history's darkest secrets, hit subscribe and keep your dial locked to the cold case frequency. We will be back soon. Stay safe and remember to check your attic.